Thank you very much. It's nice to just walk in and see some familiar faces and start talking straight away. I mean, literally, it's been like 2 minutes and the conversation already got going. So that's been quite inspiring for me to try and keep everything I'd like to say condensed a little. And maybe then we can have enough time to have a conversation together about, related subjects of sorts. My presentation and talk today is, well, first, thank you for coming and being here at 9 a.m. It's very kind of you. The talk today and presentation is about cultural bias in music technology. And I want to talk about this from the perspective of tuning, because I think tuning is a really interesting and polyvalent key that can help unlock a bunch of other related problematics that I think, at least in my perspective, are prevalent across the music tech industry, and specifically because it touches on the fundamentals of what we consider as music and our perspectives on what music is and how music is made. I don't want to be preaching or lecturing in any way, so please, I know this subject can be quite sensitive sometimes, so please don't take anything personally. I'm not here to preach or lecture. I just want to share my perspective in the hope that it can shed some light on a few misconceptions and misunderstandings, create some awareness, and then hopefully lead to more of a communal process towards tackling some of these issues, because at least in my view and with the communities that I've been in touch with, there really seems to be a kind of roadblock, and I don't think we can unpack that individually. I think it really needs to be a cohesive community effort. So hopefully this will inspire some of that. I also don't want to name and shame anyone or any particular developers or companies or softwares or anything. There might be a few references that I'll refer to today. That's purely to just make a point. I don't mean that in any negative way, so please just keep that in mind also. Yeah, I mean, as we're all aware, issues of gender and race have been, really brought to the foreground over the last couple of years. And in the discussions about the disparities across music, across technology, and across society and institutions, and specifically when we talk about things like ethics and the issues that have been coming up over the last few years with regards to AI, etc., and then now all the new developments that are happening in Web3 and the idea of ownership and collective organization and the repaving of the way that the path that we use to interact and engage with technology, I think, has all really come to the foreground. But one thing that seems to be lacking, from my perspective, is discussions about culture and how culture impacts our perspectives and the kinds of issues that we face when it comes to information that we've inherited and that we just assume is somehow sacrosanct, or a kind of information or ideas that have already been trodden through and therefore are reliable for us, that we can rely on them and move forward based on them without having to interrogate them. My perspective is that I think we really need to re-interrogate everything that all the foundations that we're standing on, so that we can really understand where they came from. I think it's fair to say, and I hope you'd all agree, that music isn't a universal language in any shape or form. And we often hear this idea that music technology is democratic and has democratized music making, specifically because of its accessibility and the distribution of both software and hardware devices around the world. But we often also tend to forget that music making around the world is based on very very, very different principles and very different ideas. And this is where the subject of tuning is, for me, really important to look at and use as a prism. Because today, when we think about music making, if we do any research about music theory, we often come across one specific perspective, which is really an Anglo-European perspective on what music is and how music is made. And in my view, being able to take some influence from other perspectives will enrich our music-making capabilities and allow for other cultures to be better represented. The development of Western music across the board really has always relied on a cross-pollination, right? Nothing is pure. There isn't a single musical culture that is pure in any shape or form. Everything is about interaction and cross-pollination. And I'm sure many of you are aware of that and understand it, but one issue that I've always come across is this incredible exceptionalism and reliance on the idea that music and music theory ultimately boils down to Anglo-European or 17th century European musical principles, right? The majority of core principles that exist in modern music technologies are the equivalent of the most basic version of Western staff notation that exists, right? A grid divided into equal divisions of time and equal divisions of pitch. Something that has been broken out of by contemporary composers from the early 20th century onwards, but somehow has remained lodged inside the technologies that we use today for music making, whether that be the grids of the DAWs or whether it be the grids of plugins and audio manipulation, things to do with pitch, things to do with time. Everything seems to ultimately rely on those fundamental principles, and those are the principles that I think we need to reinterrogate a little bit. One of the main ones, for example, if we think about tuning as a principle, if any of you have done any research or reading about tuning or music theory, you probably all come across the name of Pythagoras, right? Pythagoras, who discovered that there is a relationship between music and mathematics. Pythagoras of the Greek tradition, and the Greek tradition that represents this cradle of Western civilization, and the hub of where ideas about democracy and the arts and the sciences and music, etc., were all developed. The funny thing about Pythagoras, though, is I'm going to just read you a small quote here from Kenneth Guthrie's 1977 book called The Pythagorean Sourcebook and Library. And here he says, Pythagoras was born around 570 BCE to Nescarsus of Samos, a gem engraver, and his wife Pythais. Biographies of Pythagoras are unanimous that at an early age he traveled widely to assimilate the wisdom of the ancients wherever it might be found. He is said by Iamblichus to have spent some 22 years in Egypt studying there with the priests, and is also said to have studied the wisdom of the Chaldeans firsthand. These accounts are generally accepted by most scholars, as indeed they should be, owing to the high degree of contact between Asia Minor and other cultures. Now I'm just going to skip a couple of lines. In these distant lands, Pythagoras not only studied the sciences there cultivated, including mathematical sciences, we may safely presume, but was also initiated into the religious mysteries. And as Porphyry succinctly observes, it was from his stay among these foreigners that Pythagoras acquired the greater part of his wisdom. Another short extract from the Life of Pythagoras by Iamblichus, which was written around 250 CE. Here in Egypt, he frequented all the temples with the greatest diligence and most studious research, during which time he won the esteem and admiration of all the priests and prophets with whom he associated. Having most solicitously familiarized himself with every detail, he did not, nevertheless, neglect any contemporary celebrity, whether a sage renowned for wisdom or peculiarly performed mystery. He did not fail to visit any place where he thought he might discover something worthwhile. This is how he visited all the Egyptian priests, acquiring all the wisdom each possessed. He then passed 22 years in sanctuaries of temples, studying astronomy and geometry, and being initiated into no casual or superficial manner in all the mysteries of the gods. At length, however, he was taken captive by the soldiers of Cambyses and carried off to Babylon. Here, he was overjoyed to be associated with the Magi, who instructed him in their venerable knowledge and in the most perfect worship of the gods. Through their assistance, likewise, he studied and completed arithmetic, music, and all the other sciences. After 12 years, and about the 56th year of his age, he returned to Samos. I understand it's maybe a little bit early for like ancient history right now, but I think it's important because this is a figure that is at the core of discussions about or perspectives of what music is and how we got to where we are today. So very quickly, I just want to show you something in Google Maps. We know that Pythagoras was Greek and the Pythagoreans were Greek, and everything goes back to this Greek reference. And we know that Pythagoras was from the island of Samos. But when the internet decides to join us, I'll show you where Samos is. The reason why I mentioned Pythagoras in this information is just to say that it's very easy for us to just assume and accept this knowledge that we are given that is ultimately at the absolute core and the fundamental area of the art form that we all work in, right? And if we're just taking those things without interrogating them, then we are immediately leading ourselves down the path which is, I think, going to take us into strange places. So this is Samos in Greece when that decides to show up. And if we just start to zoom out, yeah. That's the little island, and slowly but surely, we shall get to the rest of it. Well, we'll just wait for it. There we go. There's Samos. You can see it here. And as you can probably already see, it's just here. And this is Turkey, and that's Greece, right? So just a very simple Google search of where Pythagoras comes from allows us to see that this is very clearly an area of transit, an area of pollination, right? An area of ideas that are going across cultures, and they're not driven by one singular philosophy. And I think that's what's important here. Anyway, I digress. I'm a musician, I'm a composer, I'm a researcher. I'm in the middle, well, towards the end now of a PhD in composition at the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire in Birmingham here. And my focus is trying to work on developing contemporary Arabic music. So music that is based on the fundamentals of the Arab maqam system and the logics of Arabic music, but that is somehow experimental and contemporary in the way that it approaches that. And one of the key elements of Arabic music is its intonation, right? Its tuning. And I've been researching this subject for near on 20 years now, and always struggled to try and render some of these musical ideas in using music technology, specifically because almost all the tools that we have at our disposal today are specifically programmed to render Western 12-tone equal temperament almost exclusively. Obviously, there are exceptions, and this became a huge frustration for me over many years, and I ended up putting it aside completely. But I returned to it recently because particularly of the PhD that I'm doing because of these studies, and also because I just got fed up, that I was unable to explore a musical culture that I was interested in, and I was unable to develop musical ideas. So when I started talking to people about these issues of tuning and starting to do some research, very often what I hear is that this is a technical problem that needs a technical solution, right? And this is what I thought also at the beginning. So I started working with a couple of programmers. I'm not a coder, by the way, and I'm not a programmer, but I have worked with quite a few and been involved in quite a few projects. So I started working with some coders, and I love this relationship because it feels like working with a luthier, right? You go to someone, you say, hey, I need a tool that will allow me to create a certain kind of music that I'm imagining in my head. And that person helps you make it, and it helps you get to that place. And I love this relationship, and I think it's something that's really, it's not talked about enough. This very intimate relationship, actually, that happens between musicians, artists, and programmers, and coders, and engineers. But I think it's one that's just going to keep growing and keep developing. So that's definitely something we need to nurture as much as possible. So anyway, I started working with a couple of programmers and developed a Max for Live device that would allow me to be able to very, very easily and intuitively create these different tunings and hear them and play them. And when that happened, there was a real sense of anticlimax, because it was so simple, right? And then at the same time, there was just this huge explosion of ideas. But what ended up happening actually was I just went through the motions and was trying out really pastiche ideas from, like, you know, Arabic maqam style techno, or like weird synthwave, or, you know, chiptune style programming, etc. Just because that's the stuff that was around me, and I was excited to try and hear what that would sound like in a different way. But very quickly, I realized that actually, here, what I'd done was created a means to an end. But what I was actually looking for was creative freedom. So rather than needing a technological solution to resolve a technological problem, what I was actually looking for was a creative freedom, a tabula rasa that would allow me to wake up in the morning and be in a certain kind of mood, or have a certain melody in mind, or want to interrogate a specific musical idea and be able to just sit down and do that without the hurdles, right? And this is when it dawned on me that this is far more than a technical issue. That's actually a philosophical issue, it's a historical issue, it's a political issue. Because ultimately what we're talking about here is, what perspectives are we embedding within the tools, and how much asymmetry is embedded also within them. Culturally speaking, philosophically speaking, politically speaking. And I know it feels sometimes that the music tech is kind of, you know, it's music, right? It's sound. We're exploring all these technological ideas, and it somehow maybe doesn't have that relevance, but I think it does, and I think it's something we need to try and think about. So as part of this PhD research, I decided to scrap the Max for Live project and actually try to develop something in browser. So I reached out to a design studio called Counterpoint, who tend to work on web-based projects around, you know, this intersection of generative music and web audio, web MIDI, and all the possibilities that it's now opening up. They've done a lot of work with Yuri Suzuki and his design studio Pentagram. Anyway, so we worked together to develop this tool, two tools actually that run in browser, called Lima and Apotome. And both these two tools are focused on the subject of tuning and allowing access and exploration within the realm of tuning. But we decided to make them in browser because I felt like that would be the most accessible way to be able to engage with this subject and provide contextual information, and then also reduce the barriers of entry for people, and try to inspire somehow this discussion in education, and create a tool that could be used for education as well as creative exploration. Before that, though, I want to share with you a short 2-minute recording by Wendy Carlos. Many of you have probably heard of her, Wendy Carlos from Switched on Bach and Tron and The Shining. She was a phenomenal composer and researcher, I guess, also into the technologies. And it was her birthday a couple of days ago, so happy birthday, Wendy. In the 80s, Wendy Carlos released an album called The Secrets of Synthesis, which was just around the time when digital synthesizers were starting to become easily accessible. And I think by that time, she'd spent a fortune developing her own computer systems that would allow her specifically to explore this subject of tuning. She created a series of tuning systems herself, with very much interested in the music of other parts of the world. And I just want to play you this little example, because at the end of this album called Secrets of Synthesis, which is a kind of pedagogical album that gives you an insight into her process and some of her compositional ideas of how to use synthesis to create different kinds of music. So thinking about orchestration, pointillism and hocketing, these kind of compositional techniques, and how to synthesize different sounds, etc., going into digital synthesis. And the last track on the album is called Alternative Tuning's The Future.
But the rest of my excitement is that not only can we have any possible timbre, but these can be in any possible tuning. At last, it's possible to leave the limits of the equally tempered scale and use any form of tuning that might tickle our ears. How bad and good is our 12-note scale? Let's compare, on a basic organ stop, a sustained arpeggio, first in equal temperament. Now in perfect tuning. Here's a chord, first in equal temperament. Again, in perfect tuning. I should mention that by perfect tuning here, I mean an extended form of what traditionally has been called just intonation, but carried on up to the 13th or more partial. It's easier to hear the difference with high-pitched strings. First, 2 short chords in equal temperament. And in perfect tuning. Again, but longer. First equal tempered, then perfect. A perfectly tuned scale sounds similar to the natural scale on a horn. And from that, you can certainly hear where the horn rip comes from. But for older Western music, the best way to tune is mean tone intonation. With a computer, it's simple to modulate anywhere, retuning as we go, and avoid all the wolf intervals, which was the only reason we ever gave up such a good-sounding scale in the first place. But the worst way to tune is probably this temperament of 13 equal steps. It's a good test of a tool's power that it can produce results as perfectly bad as that. The same tool will also allow us to write music in perfect tune, or copy the scales of Bali, Java, Tibet, India, or anything else we might imagine. It's a tool whose age has truly come. I can hardly wait for the next step. There's a story attributed to Sir Ernest Rutherford, which I'm constantly reminded of. He used to say, "There are only 2 kinds of science, physics and butterfly collecting." Thanks for allowing me to share a few of my favorite butterfly specimens with you.
So thank you, Wendy. I'm glad many of you here got the humor in her perspective on this. She's really amazing. But at the same time, I find listening to this actually, the more times you listen to that 13 equal tempered scale, the more you get used to it, and actually starts to sound kind of appealing. So just beware that that can actually happen. I find it incredibly sad that somebody like Wendy Carlos, who was such a visionary and such a pioneer in her time, was so excited about these particular possibilities and was exploring them, and we're still here discussing how to actually implement them 40 years later. It's crazy to me that we're still having this conversation. And why we're having this conversation is really, it's like really head-scratching. I can't understand it. So I guess most of you know about the history of MIDI, right? In the 80s, Dave Smith, Ikutaro Kakahashi, from Dave Smith Instruments and Roland, they get together, they decide to try and create this digital language that allows their instruments to talk to each other, to communicate to each other, ultimately, right? And this was essentially an economic concern. They saw the potential for the market to expand, but they knew that it would be limited if these devices couldn't talk to each other. So they created MIDI and the MIDI Association, and all these instruments started to be able to talk to one another. And then in 1992, I think almost exclusively because of the nagging of a composer called Robert Rich, who some of you might have come across. He was very good friends with Dave Smith. I've spoke to Robert about this, and he was the one who told me the stories. Robert Rich was very much interested in tuning, particularly in just intonation, and wanted to explore these possibilities in exactly the same way that Wendy outlined in this audio track just now. And so he kept pushing Dave Smith to include the ability to tune the synthesizers in different ways, and then finally managed to have his way to get that implemented in MIDI itself. And so in 1992, a thing called MIDI Tuning Standard was ratified into MIDI. And this is an incredibly future-proof part of the code that allows for all kinds of scales, both octave repeating and non-octave repeating, to a resolution of 0.0061 of a cent, right? So that's kind of slightly more than what Spotify pays its artists today, right? So, but still enough for the kind of resolution that we're talking about. And that was implemented in multiple ways. So one, you could have octave repeating tuning systems that would map across the piano keyboard or the piano roll, etc. You could also have non-octave repeating. You can change the tuning in real time. You can play one chord, let it ring, change the tuning and not affect the notes that were previously played. Okay, perfect, future-proof and suitable for all kinds of music making, from all kinds of musical cultures and all kinds of weird experimental Western ideas that were being developed, right? But this was put in as part of the sysx messages. And for some reason, it just wasn't adopted. So many synthesizers, and particularly the DAWs today, do not allow for this piece of MIDI information to be transferred across devices. That's 1992. It's there, it's ready, but nobody is implementing it. So why hasn't it been implemented, or why is it not used? And the only reason I can come to is this, that there's a certain kind of exceptionalism here, where it feels like, well, this is something that's unnecessary. We don't need it. Right? I often refer to equal temperament as the McDonald's of tuning because of its convenience, right? And some people have taken me up on that, but I really think that ultimately that's what it is, right? We are all, it's just like easily distributed, not many nutrients, not much flavor, right? But it's convenient and it's easy and it's fast, right? My problem here is that if we're talking about music technology being democratic and somehow democratizing the music making, experience, then why is there no enough choice? And we to think about choice when it comes to what kind of sound you want to use, or what kind of device you want to use, or what kind of process you want to use. But where is the choice when it comes to the actual fundamental principles of what music is? Right? Wendy Carlos has a great article from I think, '87 called At the Crossroads, which she published literally talking about this idea of being at the crossroads between analog music technology and digital music technology, and particularly focused on tuning as well, and the idea that with digital tools, now all of these doors are going to be open to us. 1987, 1992, it starts to happen, but then nobody picks up on it. So ultimately, those doors are shut. And I know there are many people who are invested in this subject, who are trying to create tools that allow for the interrogation and the exploration of these ideas. I know that some DAWs also include some of these possibilities, but it's always very limited, right? I'll give you a couple of examples. Logic was one of the first softwares to allow for non-equal tempered tunings. It only allows for 12-tone cyclic octave repeating tunings, and you can only save one user tuning. And there's no way to switch between it. So I started asking myself, well, why? Why were these technological decisions taken? Why was this approach taken, especially when they had access to Robert Rich, who was one of the main composers and researchers involved in the development of MTS? And I can't for the life of me think of a reason except for that there is a kind of Western perspective on what tuning is. So very often, the concept of tuning is conflated with the idea of a scale. A tuning system is also considered to be a scale. But in many musical cultures, it's not the way that it works. You might have a tuning system that has 22 divisions of the octave, unequal divisions, or 53, or however many you want. But subsets will be used. Modes and scales will be used based on that set. And so this is a perspective that hasn't really been approached in any detail. Another perspective would be, well, how can we modulate some of these ideas? If we think about key signatures and key modulations, then why isn't the same not also possible for these modal modulations that exist within these kinds of musical cultures, or these musical fundamentals that we can all explore, right? Back to my original point, this isn't, well, I didn't mention it earlier, so it's not an original point, but this isn't about trying to somehow allow non-Western musicians to be able to perform their ethnic or traditional music using these tools. This is about musical creativity. It's about trying to inspire innovation and the breaking of the rules that have existed for so many years across all musical cultures, and to try and find new things, individual things too. Just to quickly jump to a non-tuning issue, if we think about the grid of time, for example, that's another main one. A tool like Logic, you can turn the grid off and you just have this plain background. And I don't know if any of you have ever tried it, but it's actually incredibly scary at the beginning. When you open a DAW and you see no grid lines, it's weird, right? But there's something about it that feels like you're going into a kind of black hole where you're able to find something else, rely on your ears more rather than rely on what you see more. When I noticed this, I realized here how important the visual representation of musical information is as well, and how much our UIs and the visual environments that represent the sonic, right, are ultimately having a direct impact on the music that we're making. I cannot tell you the number of contemporary classical music concerts that I've been to where what I hear sounds like Sibelius playback, right? That's not because the musicians are no good. That's not because the composer is no good. That's because the tool, the interface, is having an impact, and particularly the playback, is having an impact on the musical idea that's being developed and leading the composer to create something that ends up fitting within the logics of the tool itself, rather than the composer being able to create something. And I know we have lots of incredibly great composers that have broken all of these rules, but we also have the majority who are being influenced by these ideas directly. And I see this really as a limiting principle, because what has happened is that we are somehow have become subject to these defaults, right? And these non-neutral defaults that we see as being fundamental, sacrosanct values. Just like when you open up a tuning software and you see everything set to 0, and it represents 12-tone equal temperament, but everything is set to 0, so it makes you feel like, well, this is the fundamental starting point that we're moving from, that it is the core that everything else is derived from, right? But that's just not true. Historically, it's not true. Musically, it's not true. And philosophically, it's not true either. So I did the same experiment of the rhythmic grid in Ableton. In Ableton, when you turn the grid off, you still see the grid, but it's dotted lines, like dashed lines, right? Okay, I understand possibly why they did this. I haven't spoken to them about this particular idea, but maybe it's to avoid this like really intimidating void that happens when you see no grid lines, because we've become so used to it, but it still affects you. I was working on a collaboration with a Carnatic vocalist. His name's Nakul Krishnamurti. He lives in Glasgow, contemporary experimental piece. And whilst trying to develop this, I found myself consistently having to fight against these grid lines that I was seeing, because we were working with grooves and rhythmic structures that don't fit cleanly into that. Even if you change the time signature from the default 4/4 into 9/8, you're still going to see a 4/4 grid of bars, of sections. And those grids are even highlighted in different colors. So that visual imposition is always there, and it makes a big difference. So what I'm trying to say is that we have the resolution within the fundamental code that allows all of our music technology to run, but why are we not using it? And this isn't just about trying to allow for tuning, right? But let's take, for example, the piano roll. The piano itself as a representative of equal temperament is really it's a sad thing, because the piano was never created just to represent equal temperament, right? The keyboard interface is a mechanical interface, and there are strings. You can tune those strings to whatever you like. Today, there are even sample libraries and plugins of pianos that don't allow pitch bend. Why? It just makes no sense to me. Is this thing so like holy that we cannot penetrate it in any way? Right? We can put the sound through a tape, like an old cassette tape emulation and mangle it to shreds, but we can't change the tuning at the fundamental level of actually playing it. Makes no sense to me. The resolution is there, and the implications of that resolution I think are really, really valuable. Imagine that you could type in beat groupings into your time signature and then see those beat groupings as a grid, right? So the issue here is not that a grid exists. It's not a binary of grid or no grid, whether that be in pitch or in time, but it's about the malleability of that grid, the ability of that grid to represent different kinds of grids, the ability for the user and the composer to be able to create their own grid and work to that. So a grid is ultimately just a way of being able to help us navigate a certain kind of space or time, right? But why can't we create our own? Imagine the piano roll. If the piano roll, you could just remove it and it would just end up being lines. Celemani's Melodyne does this amazingly. You can remove the piano roll and you can just see your pitch information as lines. And the distance between them represents the distance of the intervals. And it makes for a much more intuitive and natural process of music making. All of this, I'll share Lima with you very quickly, but I'd like to leave some time for talking. So ultimately, Lima just allows you to create tuning systems by deciding on your reference pitch. You can input your octave repeating tuning systems only for now using this simple ruler, and you can type in your values. And then you can map them just playing with your QWERTY keyboard. And then you can also send that output via MIDI to virtual buses or hardware or external hardware, including MPE. And what's valuable here for me is that it can represent the information in very different ways. There's also a database that I've been working on. This is something we were discussing earlier, just before we started. But what's nice about the way that the tuning systems are represented here is that you can see them in ways that normally we wouldn't be able to see. And it creates a completely different environment for the actual music-making process because there's a sense of choice, right? And for me, this idea of the default values automatically allowing for something to happen is understandable in music technology. You know, you load up a plugin, you want to be able to hear what it does straight away. But I've found while working on these projects that actually choice as a default, as opposed to some kind of sonic or sound-making thing that happens straight away, is actually much, much more valuable. It's much more empowering. I'll leave it there just to leave some time for questions, but thank you for listening, and I hope it was useful. These tools are available for free online. There are tutorials, there's a bunch of stuff. My email's in the user guide. I'm on all the usual social media channels. If anybody wants to get in touch, please do. So thank you very much. Thanks.
For that. What are some steps you could recommend to developers to move away from equal tempered?
I think it's not so much just about equal temperament. I think we need to think about how these musical fundamentals affect the core principles of music technology. And therefore, I think some more discussions, communication between music tech, the world of music tech, and maybe the world of ethnomusicology. I know academia has its own problems too, but there are plenty of ethnomusicologists like myself who are young, who are interested in all kinds of different things, you know, that can participate in this discussion. Number two, I think we really need to try to get to the core of these problems and resolve them. Like I've had some discussions with the MIDI Association, and as far as they're concerned, this is already resolved from their side, right? They've done the work, 1992. So what we need to do is try and figure out how, moving into the world of MIDI 2.0, we don't carry the same baggage with us, and that we're able to find solutions that are actually meaningful for everybody, and not just technical solutions, you know, really philosophical ones. And that's why, as we were discussing earlier, I think it needs to be a communal change. We need to start working together, and both from within the music tech community and outside the music tech community, maybe with universities, maybe with you know, independent organizations, whatever. But this needs to be a communal effort, because since launching this project in January, many people have reached out to me, and I've been in touch with many people about this subject, and so many of us are working on things individually. And this is also something we were saying earlier. There's so much individual energy being spent into these in these directions, and it's a shame that that can't be brought together so that we can actually work as a community and resolve these issues and just move on, because like it's just unnecessary. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Thank you, first of all. And so during your talk, you mentioned 1 or 2 times, you invoked the idea of how music tech is said to have democratized music and music making. And I wasn't sure whether or not you were invoking that as kind of in seriousness as a promise that hasn't been fulfilled, or kind of, I suppose, arguing against that idea fundamentally? And so I suppose the question is then, do you think that music tech has democratized music, can democratize music, or should it even democratize music? I feel it's fundamentally related to this discussion.
100%. Thank you very much. I wasn't clear yet. I think that it has somehow allowed access. I don't think it's democratized, because ultimately democracy is about choice. But so one, you need the choices, but then you also need to be able to make an informed choice. So it's not, the onus isn't only on music tech. The majority of musicians that I've talked to have no idea about tuning. Incredible musicians, right? People who've studied up to master's level, PhDs, no idea whatsoever. So that means there's a problem in our education system too, in the way that we're integrating, that we're discussing these subjects on that level, and then how that is impacting onto the tech sphere itself. Do I think it can democratize? Yeah, I think it can. I mean, I think the technology allows for the choice. It's there, but we just need to use that to our advantage and allow for that choice to exist. We all should be able to make music. It shouldn't have to be all somehow confined to Anglo-European white male composers' vision of what music is. And I know that we've broken away from that now when it comes to the sonics, but Wendy Carlos mentions the 3 T's of music: timbre, timing, and tuning. Right? Those are not all fulfilled. So that's where I think that the discussion needs to go. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Yesterday we had Ben Suffer talk about hardware production and how, if you want to be commercial, you sort of just have to go for the lowest cost components and maybe you compromise. So I'm wondering if this is what's happened with this music technology, that they're not trying to innovate, they're just trying to do economies of scale. So the question for you is, do you think this is going to be a big company that innovates to differentiate, to grab a new market share, or do you think a startup or open source community needs to bootstrap this, and sort of maybe a startup innovates and brings this, and then the bigger companies realize it's a market segment that they need to grab?
Yeah, I think that's already been done a little bit with the launch of Odd Sound's MTS ESP plugin that happened in March this year in collaboration with Aphex Twin. And they've tried to create a new kind of standard, and they're encouraging developers to implement MTS ultimately, because that's how, that's the best way to do this. And it's the best way to be backwards compatible as well, right? But I don't know how much luck they're having. I think there needs to be a proper discussion in these kinds of conferences across the big companies, and maybe also with the MIDI Association, in order to deal with this on a fundamental level. Because when you have startups and other individuals who are creating tools, people are doing amazing things, right? They need to just be able to access that core data, right? And be able to deal with it. So one project I'm trying to develop at the moment is to turn Lima, for example, into a repository. So with an API, so that any other tools or softwares or websites would be able to access the repository and therefore pull out the tuning data with all its contextual information. You can see, just by visualizing something like this, you can already tell where is the tonic, what are the main pitches that are used, what are primary, what are secondary. There's so much information that you can represent with very small amount of detail or a very small amount of data. So I think trying to do this as a community of developers and of technologists is going to be the best way. So that might need some kind of consortium, it might need another conference, it might just need a big brainstorming session where we all get together and then actually take concrete steps to make this happen.